Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to another Hearthstone deck guide. This guide is based on Mart's excellent thread on Hearthporn, a link to which is in the video description. But I want to talk to you a little bit about Renolock. Since the release of League of Explorers, this deck has become very, very popular indeed. Arguably the most popular kind of deck that's in Hearthstone at the moment. And with really good reason. The decks that you can get with Renolock combine elements of the control aspect of Handlock that we saw so powerful previously with the new anti-aggro card, Reno Jackson. So I'm going to talk through a couple of the deck types and construction, as well as what you might want to be doing during your games, and how you can use this deck to really dominate your way up through the ladder and try and get some fantastic games of Hearthstone under your belt. So first of all, before we talk about specific deck constructions, let's take a look at the core cards that make up this deck. First and foremost, we can't talk about Renolock without talking about Reno Jackson. So Reno Jackson is a new card from League of Explorers. It's a 4/6 and has an amazing battle cry, which is if you have no more than one of each card in your deck, you heal yourself up to full health. Now, this is particularly important because it dictates everything as far as deck construction goes. In order to make sure that we always get good value from Reno Jackson, by definition, Reno decks only ever have one of each card. And that dictates the way you build all of your decks, and it also means that every card has to have unique value. And of course, gaining up to 29 health for 6 mana is absolutely fantastic and really, really strong. It also contributes very, very well with Warlock because Life Tap allows you to pay 2 health to draw a card. You can keep using it and get yourself down to a reasonably low amount of health. Draw as many powerful cards from your deck as possible and then use Reno Jackson to heal up. Also, your standard Handlock just benefits from having really, really strong cards that you can play after you start losing health. So examples of this might include Twilight Drake when you've drawn a lot of cards, and Molten Giant on the board as well. So Reno Jackson is absolutely the very core of this deck. But what other cards can we also expect to have? So I'm going to split this up into class cards and neutral cards. Let's take a look at some of the class cards that are in a Renolock deck. You've got Mortal Coil, Dark Bomb, Dark Peddler, Demon Wrath, Imp Gang Boss, Hellfire, Implosion, Shadow Flame, Siphon Soul, and Lord JARAXXUS. These cards aren't in every single deck, but they tend to be in the vast majority of Renolock decks. And as you can tell, all of them are really good Warlock cards that you would typically see in a decent number of decks. There are also a number of neutral cards that tend to appear in most Handlock decks as well. So to rattle off through those two, we have Zombie Chow, Ironbeak Owl, Big Game Hunter, BRANN Bronzebeard, who we'll talk about in a second, Defender of Argus, Piloted Shredder, Twilight Drake, Antique Healbot, Sludge Belcher, Emperor Thaurissan, Sylvanas Windrunner, Dr. Boom, and Molten Giant. Now, there are plenty of nice synergies that are going on here. BRANN Bronzebeard, of course, is one in particular. Your battle cries trigger twice. That tends to be the kind of card that if your opponent is not able to kill it, you kind of want to silence it pretty quickly. You get all sorts of nice combos like BRANN Bronzebeard into Twilight Drake, for example, to have a ridiculously powerful mid-game minion. So let's take a look at some of the ways you might want to be playing Renolock, moving from the early game into the mid game into the late game, because the kind of patterns that you tend to see are very, very similar regardless of which version of the deck you're playing. In the early game, you're basically playing control. So it's all about surviving and drawing as many cards as you can. And because of your hero power, it's really easy to keep drawing cards. That's why you don't see Loot Hoarders or Azure Drakes or anything like that in this deck. You can just tap your hero power and continuously draw cards. That's fine. And in order to survive this early game, we basically rely on a couple of things. We have our sticky minions. So you've got your Zombie Chow, your Imp Gang Boss, your Piloted Shredder, and your Twilight Drake. You've got your area of effect removal as well, like your Demon Wrath and your Hellfire. And finally, you have single removal, just getting rid of annoying cards that really shouldn't be occupying the board from your opponent's half so you can survive longer. So you're looking at Mortal Coil and Implosion mainly. So that tends to be how you survive the early game, and of course, you are constantly hitting your hero power to draw as many cards as you can, being careful not to burn cards, of course. You can't have more than 10 in your hand at any one time. So that tends to be the way you play the early game, more or less any version of Renolock. And then going into the mid game, against aggro decks, at this point you should really start to stabilize. And you probably want to be using Reno Jackson quite early on turn 6 if it turns out, oh, hang on a second, I'm not really stabilizing and I need to heal up quickly. But ideally, if you can help it and you've stabilized earlier or have more health, you can keep Reno Jackson and play him later in the game to increase the longevity you have in the matchup. So mid-game sticky minions can include your Sludge Belchers, Piloted Shredders, Twilight Drakes, and Emperor Thorasans. And of course, Emperor Thorassan included in that because basically your opponent can't afford to leave it up. You then have Shadow Flames as well that can be used later on, and that can be used in conjunction maybe with something like an Abusive Sergeant that appears in some Renolock decks, for instance. You then have Siphon Soul and Big Game Hunter as your slightly more upgraded removal options in case your opponent happens to play something particularly impressive. And then finally, just in case you need it, you have your Antique Healbot in addition to Reno Jackson. And in some decks, you have the Earthen Ring Farseer as well, just to provide a little bit of healing and keep you in the game that much longer. So just to reiterate, you want to keep Reno Jackson as long as possible. It gives you more time to find answers by tapping into your hero power, and it also means that you can just last longer in the game in general after you get those answers. But always make sure you know how much damage your opponent can do from hand at any one time. You're looking at combinations like Force of Nature, Savage Roar. You're looking at combinations like even Frostbolt, Iceland's Firebolt, that kind of thing. And you always want to make sure that your opponent can't kill you in one turn. If he or she can, you need to make sure you have Taunt on the board. You need to make sure you play Reno if it turns out you can't guarantee surviving against a particular combo they might have in hand. So always be aware of this. You're mainly looking at this kind of play against mages, hunters, and druids. So make sure you take particular care when playing against those classes. Also, during the middle game, you might find that you have more and more mana and you draw into BRANN Bronzebeard, and that's particularly useful because your battle cries trigger twice. Now, when these trigger twice, there are a number of synergies you want to be using with your deck that we spoke about a little bit earlier. But just to give you a bit of an example now, you're taking a look at Bronzebeard Dark Peddler, for example, where you can discover 2 one-cost cards instead of 1. That's particularly useful because you get your Mortal Coils, your Power Overwhelmings, Abusive Sergeants, and additional Zombie Chows. That's great. And of course, getting multiple Zombie Chows and Mortal Coils isn't a problem. That's not in your deck, you're getting it straight into your hand, so that's fine as far as Reno is concerned. You then, of course, have your Soulfire as well, and potentially a Void Walker. So all good one-cost cards. You can then play BRANN into Twilight Drake, and that just gives the Drake ridiculous amount of hit points. Fairly self-explanatory. So in a situation where you'd normally have a 4-6, well, guess what? You have a 4-12 now, etc., etc. Antique Healbot is also particularly good if you're getting really close to needing to use Reno, and you're able to use BRANN Antique Healbot instead. All of a sudden, you're healing for 16 health. That is absolutely huge. And finally, let's not forget Defender of Argus. You manage to add +2/+2 to the minions either side of it instead of +1/+1. And of course, you still gain the 2 taunt minions. Very, very powerful combinations to have there. And some nice stuff that you can do with BRANN going into the mid game in a Renolock deck. Now, once you get to the late game, this is where the strategies for a couple of the Renolock decks tend to diverge a little bit, and I'll go through a couple of those deck types in just a sec. But you're looking at your really strong minions like your Sylvanuses, your Dr. Booms, your Thorasans, your Molten Giants, and Lord JARAXXUS as well at a time that's particularly appropriate. You need to be a little bit careful with Lord JARAXXUS and Reno. If you play JARAXXUS, Reno heals your hero up to full health, which means that JARAXXUS has a health of 15. If you get down to 1 and you play Reno, you only get healed up to 15, not to 30. So something worth remembering there. You need to be a little bit careful with JARAXXUS, and don't forget he's at 15 health as well. Reno Jackson heals your hero up to full health, not to 30. So you play JARAXXUS, you go to 15 health, you then go down to 1 and you play Reno. That brings you back up to 15, not 30. So just something worth remembering there. Generally speaking, JARAXXUS is great to play when your opponent is started running out of ideas on how to counter your board. So let's say, for example, you're able to play JARAXXUS plus the hero power generating a 6/6 Infernal on the same turn. Maybe you've done this because you've had Emperor Thaurissan earlier on in the game. If you can do that, fantastic, especially if your opponent has no cards, because it becomes really difficult for them to remove the 6/6s, and you tend to be able to remove anything that they pick up and put onto the board and generally win that race, even though you're on a maximum of 15 health. So that tends to be the way, in general, you play JARAXXUS. So Renolock decks tend to broadly be split into 3 different categories. We have Demon Renolocks, we have mid-game heavy Renolocks, and we have combo Renolocks. And I'll be talking through each of those styles in detail. But first we'll talk about the Demon Renolocks. Now I have here the Race Renolock deck from Hearthstone, one of the earlier Demon Renolock decks, and generally speaking, the combination you're looking at here is being able to play Voidcaller into Mulligans. You've played a lot of really good cards leading into the mid-game already. You've tapped for a lot of life. Maybe you've played Reno Jackson and you're basically full up to health. You've got fantastic number of cards in your hand. Your opponent's floundering a bit. Mulligans hopefully finishes off the game. That tends to be the idea here. Now, there's an updated version of this from Tempo Storm, which was released a little bit later, and basically that's even more aggressive on the demon front. You basically had a Doom Guard in place of a Molten Giant, and this allowed you to hopefully get a little bit more burst damage off at the end of the game as well, in addition to maybe surprising your opponent with the Doom Guard instead of the Mulligans. If you're playing against a Renolock deck and you see a Voidcaller on the field though, make sure you have your big game hunter ready, because most of the time you will see a Mulligans being called out from that Voidcaller, so always worth noting. Now you then have a second style, and this is the mid-game heavy style. So the Demon Voidcaller, you know, the combination that doesn't really help you get a good board presence in the mid-game. It lets you have a fantastic finisher, fine, but what are you going to do surviving up until then? So people who were building these decks, they were looking for a different way to kind of combo that up. And one of the ways to deal with this is to introduce Fugan and Stalag. So you have your wonderful zombie minions. There you go. Popped into your deck here, and the mid-game becomes an awful lot stronger. You also have to be a little bit careful as well on silencing the minions, because you need to make sure your 11/11 Thaddeus doesn't get called out. For those of you who are less familiar, let's go ahead and scroll through this deck list. If both Stalag and Fugan die in the same game, you summon Thaddeus, which is an 11/11 minion. You have to be very careful when you're silencing these as well, because it only applies to the death rattle on the second one, if that makes sense. So let's say you play Stalag and you have Fugan in hand. Silencing Stalag does no good, because you play Fugan, and Fugan's death rattle is if Stalag died early in the game, summon Thaddeus. So whenever you see this combination, silencing the minion that dies second is actually really quite important. Otherwise you have an 11/11 to deal with, which is extremely unpleasant. So that tends to be a really good combination for keeping board control and keeping really strong minions on the board in the mid game. So you always want to make sure that your opponent has ideally used the silence on some other threat that you've put on the board before you play your second minion of Fugan or Stalag, so that you can get Thaddeus out on the board as often as possible. Tice has also basically fine-tuned the Stalag Fugan sort of mid-range Renolock recently, and produced a version that's even more controlling of the board and preventing your opponent from doing much in the mid-game. So we have additional cards like the Senjin Shieldmaster and the Acidic Swampoos added into the Renolock deck to really sort of tighten the grip on the mid-game there and make sure that your opponent can never quite get a board of his or her own rolling. So that tends to be the point. Now, I want to move on a bit and talk about the combo Renolock as well. This is Dog's combination Renolock, and it combines the 20 damage combo of Leroy Jenkins plus Power Overwhelming plus Faceless Manipulator. So you basically have double Leroy Jenkins with Power Overwhelming. And Renolock plus this can be really, really fantastic. For me personally, I actually prefer playing the mid-range Renolock with the Stalag and Fugan sort of combination there, but when you actually get the combo off, it's so satisfying. And I've played games with both on ladder, and I have to admit it is quite fun when you manage to get this off. Now, before I go any further, it is worth noting that the combination that I've just mentioned costs 11 mana, so it is reliant on Emperor Thaurissan earlier on in the game to reduce the costs of those cards so that you can get that out on the board. So this combination, Leroy Jenkins, Faceless Manipulator, Power Overwhelming, make sure you get the order right, of course, Power Overwhelming first, is fantastic, but you need to be able to set it up correctly. And this might suit more the kind of player that is more used to Druid combo decks, potentially our good old patron guys who are lurking around in the background looking for nice combos to play. This could suit your style of play a little bit more. It's also a little bit less expected because technically this combo deck still runs Stalag and Fugan. So at first glance, it's not that clear to your opponent that you're actually running this. So you really need to be careful. You've only got 2 cards that basically are different to the normal deck. So it could potentially be very, very unexpected and difficult to deal with from your opponent's point of view. So if you're ever playing against a Renolock and you suspect that combo might be something that he or she has in hand, or you've seen the Thaurissan get played, bear in mind that this combination can deal up to 20 damage, and try and plan your turns and plan your gameplay accordingly. So in short, we have 3 different combinations of play here from our Renolock. We have our Demon Renolock with our Voidcaller into Mal'Ganis. We have our mid-range heavy Renolock with our Stalag and Fugan. And we also have our combo Renolock with the combination of Leroy Jenkins, Power Overwhelming, and Faceless Manipulator. All 3 are viable, and all 3 have achieved really good results on the ladder, and the meta is constantly changing, so you want to be able to adapt to what you think best suits not only your style of play, but what people around you are playing as well. So we've covered previously in the video what we're doing generally in the early, mid, and late game as a Reno Warlock, but let's take a look now at some of the mulligans you might want to be doing. It's very important that against any deck that you consider even vaguely aggro, you keep Reno Jackson. You might have to play Reno very, very quickly on turn 6, but your opponent's hand will hopefully start running out of steam at that point, so once you heal back up, you're going to be in a great position to take the game, but you need to keep Reno if you have them in your starting hand. So generally speaking, against any sort of aggro decks, you're looking at Secret Paladin, Face Shaman, Tempo Mage, Face Hunter, these kind of decks, you always want to be keeping Reno Jackson. You always want to be keeping really good cards like Zombie Chow, Imp Gang Boss, Demon Wrath as well, and Hellfire. All cards that are very useful to clear the board and wipe out any annoying minions at the beginning of the game for your opponent. Dark Bomb is also worth noting. Probably in all of the matchups I just spoke about except for Face Hunter, because you're going to get those sticky minions that you might want to just sweep off the board at the beginning of the game to make sure they don't get too much momentum. So for example, Knife Juggler for Secret Paladin, Tunnel Trogs for Face Shaman, and Mana Worms or potentially Sorcerer's Apprentice for Tempo Mages as well. Now, in the case of Face Hunter, there tends to be a lack of getting rid of your minions on the board early because they're just trying to kill you very quickly. So that becomes a really nice excuse to keep BRANN Bronzebeard, for example, because it's unlikely as soon as you play it, they'll have a solution to take it out unless they use all their minions to trade into it. So that tends to be a little bit more fun. It also means you can do things like keep taunt minions like Sludge Belcher just to make sure that when you get to that stage of the game, if it turns out it's not going quite as well as you had hoped, you can make sure you get a nice body in the way of them doing damage to your face. Now, against control, so you're looking at priests and warriors mainly, and potentially other warlocks as well, You want to be keeping some more of your mid-game minions, and you're a little bit less concerned with removing what they have early game. So you're looking at keeping your piloted shredders, for example. You almost certainly always want your Dark Peddler against control variations that you're playing against, and potentially your Twilight Drakes as well. So those kind of cards are the ones you want to be keeping for the longer matchups, because you can just keep tapping into cards and playing the Twilight Drake, not really worrying that your opponent has a very strong early board, for instance. So that just about wraps it up from me as far as this Renolock video is concerned. The link to the Hearth Pawn thread by Mart is in the video description as well, so make sure you go ahead and check that out. But nothing beats going out there and playing these decks for yourself. I've done what I can to give you a brief overview, but there are so many fun combinations and potential tweaks to the decks that aren't even popular in the meta yet, but could end up being great. BRANN Bronzebeard, for example, can combo with cards like Bomb Lobber that we haven't seen in any of these decks, but just imagine how devastating that kind of combination can be. These kind of things are things that will continue to be explored in Renolock variations, and if you found a combination that works particularly well for you, make sure you go ahead and leave it in the comments and let me know how you've managed to make this work for your particular style of play. So thanks very much for watching, guys. Make sure you go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps an awful lot. And we'll see you next time for more Hearthstone deck guides. Take care.